Yeah, hi guys. Welcome. It's probably worth mentioning as well at the start that we've got a Q&A function available at the bottom of the screen. So please do feel free to pop any questions as we go through. We're just going to start by introducing ourselves. My name's Chelsea. I'm the strategy director at Quantum. My background is quite shopper and retail led. So really spent the last kind of about 10 years thinking about how we influence and shape consumer behavior, particularly in the sort of more conversion nudge part of the funnel. And I've been looking about how we implement behavioral economics for clients that include retailers like McDonald's and Adidas, and some more brand-led third-party retail activations in terms of brands like Adidas, Aperol and Hasbro.
And hi everyone, I'm Nick, Head of Creative Strategy here at Quantum. I've been working in and around agencies for about 15 years or so, helping brands unlock the power of experiences to emotionally connect with their consumers. And a big part of that has been understanding and applying the principles of psychology to experience design, as well as helping clients appreciate the often irrationality of consumers means that sometimes it can also benefit their brands to think irrationally too. So some of what we'll cover here today will hopefully reveal how some of those principles can be applied to brand experiences as well as in the retail environment. Cool. So we like to think that we behave really logically as human beings, that we know how and why we make certain choices, but really that's not quite true. What behavioral economics helps us do is combine psychology and economics to sort of codify how people actually make decisions, which is actually often quite irrational, rather than how they should make decisions according to more sort of traditional economic theories. So it explores the biases, emotions, and social influences that ultimately shape the choices that we make in things like spending, saving, and investing. And it's something that marketers have been using for quite some time now, but it's only really in the last sort of 10 years or so that its effects have been properly applied and have really come into their own in a very mainstream way. And as an agency at Quantum, we really believe that understanding some of these codes can help us help brands connect with their audiences on a much deeper and more meaningful level. And that's what really kind of spurred the creation of this playbook.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, we tend to think ourselves as rational creatures, but actually very often we're post-rationalizing and we're looking for reasons to help us understand why we've behaved that we have. And I think data is really good at telling us what's happening, but actually it's not very good at telling you why for all the reasons that Nick mentioned. It's inherently flawed because so much of our behavior is automatic and subconscious. So there's no amount of research that's going to uncover those heuristics that tip people into behavior. Data's also, it really talks about what's happened in the past. But if you follow the data and just do more of the same, you can only get yourself and push yourself so far, which is why creativity is there, right? It's about pushing you through. But actually, if you can combine creativity with behavioral economics, then you can really come up with campaigns that lean on some science and that are grounded in much more effective ways of changing behavior.
And we work with brands to help all sorts of problems that kind of go all the way through the consumer journey. And some of the heuristics and biases that we're going to discuss today, they do overlap and there are shades of grey between them. And this sort of path to purchase is no longer a linear one. Consumers kind of come into this in various different ways and at different points. But aligning some of these tools and these biases to these different sort of mindsets, I suppose, can help clients sort of utilize them to solve different types of problems. So that's really why we created this playbook, harnessing behavioral economics to help understand, strategize, and implement human psychology for the brands that we work with. And in it, we explore tried and tested aspects of consumer behavior and explain how it can be used to maximize results and really help you stand out as a brand. So we will share a copy of the full playbook with everyone listening today after the webinar. I hope it's really useful for you. We're also running a series of workshop sessions with clients, which we'll touch on towards the end of the webinar, where we can help you apply some of these approaches to your brand and really use it as a flywheel for success. But getting into today's session, we thought we'd look at two different categories of heuristics and biases that mainly affects the work that we do. So as people and consumers, depending on what mode and environment that we're in, we typically find ourselves in either a choosing or an experiencing mindset. And there are obviously crossovers between these two. Brands are increasingly recognizing the power of experiential in forming opinions and changing behaviors. And often you're seeing like brand experience kind of bleed into retail a lot more. But we find this as quite a useful way of thinking about consumer psychology and sort of dividing it into these two camps.
Oh, so I'm gonna start off by talking a bit about the choosing brain and specifically what are some of the core heuristics when we're in that kind of more conversion part of the funnel. And I think just to put this into a bit of context, we make about 35,000 choices a day, which is absolutely ginormous, right? When we're grocery shopping, that's between about 200 and several thousand. So if you think about the mental load, it's no surprise that our brain has looked for ways to shortcut and take some of that load off us. And I think really kind of the closer you get to decision making, it's particularly when you're making multiple decisions on top of each other, the more you'll find heuristics taking over. So it's absolutely fundamental when we're thinking about the retail space. And so with that, I think there is almost a fundamental rule of shopper, and really that's going to kind of lead the flow of the rest of what I'm going to share with you today. But what we like to think that we make perfect choices, but if you think what you'd need to be able to do that, we'd have to be able to, articulate and put a value on all the benefits of one option, and then be able to, compare that to all the other options available to us. And we simply don't have that kind of mental capacity to be able to do that. So we're really not trying to make perfect choices. I think the other part to this is as humans, we feel losses more than gains. It's thought that the pain of losing something is psychologically twice as powerful as gaining something of the equivalent value. So losing £10 hurts us twice as much as finding £10 does. So we're inherently risk averse as people, and so the fundamental rule of shopper is we're not trying to make perfect choices. We're actually trying to make the least bad choice. And that can often sound like just a sort of play on semantics, but actually, when you start to really kind of apply that thinking, it fundamentally changes the priority and the perspective in which the way that you start to think about shopper messaging and campaigns and what we're trying to do. So really a lot of shopper marketing when we're looking at behavioral economics is thinking about how do you de-risk products and choice. And I think one of the first ways that you can do that is through the familiarity bias, right? New things just are inherently risky. We have a deep-rooted preference for things that feel familiar and safe over the things that are new and unknown. And that's a lesson that Ford really learned when they were creating their line of electric vehicles. So, of course, they wanted consumers to think that these were really modern vehicles and was a really different way of doing things. And so, the management team decided that they would launch these cars under a whole new brand. But the problem that they ran into, and the kind of appetite for that was in terms of like the soft launch and some of their research was actually consumers are already pretty wary of electric cars. It kind of always felt a bit scary and new, and they weren't too sure of it. And actually, what the new branding was doing was compounding that problem. It was making the unfamiliar feel even more unfamiliar. Now, luckily, someone decided to bring in a consumer psychologist who worked with the team and the board to get them to work with the existing familiarity and preference, not against it, and simply create electric versions of their existing cars. So, the thinking here was, people already love their Bronco. Those people are much more receptible to an electric Bronco and being interested in an electric version. And it works, right? At the time, at least, the brand couldn't make enough of these cars. So it's a really, it's a simple rule and one that kind of feels inherently true, and we understand the benefit of familiarity. But I think as marketeers, there is kind of always a an ambition to drive into the new and exciting. And that's where we get to our next principle, the novelty familiar gap, because there's a flaw, right? Familiar things feel safe and we're drawn to them and they help us make a decision quickly. But of course, they don't have the same dopamine effect, sorry, dopamine hit as things that are new. Things that are new, exciting, and our brain is designed to notice and register the novel. So if new things capture our attention and familiar things help us buy and choose, really the trick is how do you start to satisfy the right amounts of each? So the way that I tend to think of this is, if we're thinking like the Ford example, the more novel your product is, the more familiarity cues you need to play on. Similarly, on the sort of other end of the scale, the more familiar your product is, the more you need to start thinking about how you push the codes of the category to offer something that it doesn't necessarily as a product need to be new, but needs to touch on a culturally novel idea. And I think that's often the play and the grounding that marketeers need to work with. Another way that you can really play with that novelty familiarity gap is something called the sandwiching technique. And my favorite example of this is with the song Hey Ya by Outkast. So the record producers behind that song were feeling pretty confident that they were going to have a hit on their hands. They'd used prediction technology that was very reassuring to them, and they invested a lot of money into the band and the song. But when that song went on to start being played on the radio, a massive third of listeners were switching stations. People were just turning it off. At the absolute other end of the scale, there were songs that people claimed they actively disliked, but that were keeping radio numbers really high. So much so that it became a thing in LA that to play Celine Dion songs regularly at the time when they knew viewer numbers were being registered, and it was a way of bolstering their position. It became almost a bit of an industry secret. So researchers were brought in to discover what was happening. And what they discovered was that people, even though they didn't like or claimed to not like Celine Dion songs, they didn't turn them off when they became on the radio because the song sounded exactly as they were expecting it to. It was familiar to them. Hey Ya by Outkast, on the other hand, was so different to everything else that was being played and different even to the music that Outkast was known to. It was having the opposite effect. That unfamiliar harmony structure was making people, instantly just kind of feel a bit uncomfortable and turn the radio over. So the way that they solved this problem was that radio DJs were asked to sandwich Hey Ya between two familiar songs. So you'd go Celine Dion, Hey Ya, and sort of something similar. Um, and it worked, right? Singers got they did that until listeners got used to the sound, and of course the song went on to be an absolute huge hit. So, I think you can apply that very much in retail and brand as well. So the sandwiching technique is really used by a lot behind McDonald's product and marketing strategy. And if you think of McDonald's as a kind of as a brand, it very much exists on habits. People tend to go in and have the same orders. Very few deviate from their favorite product choice. But McDonald's recognizes that consumers at least want the illusion of choice. They need to inject new news and excitement periodically into the brand. So they do this in a couple of ways. One of the most obvious ones is their Taste of the World range, which comes in for a couple of weeks every year, and they can make a big news and build excitement of the fact that they've got some new products launching. But essentially, that range is just their core range with a few minor details tweaked. And they're really developed to be just different enough so that they feel familiar to the consumer, but they have the novelty and excitement factor. So that's how they do the product range. But then interestingly as well, they'll make sure that they sandwich new products in between existing favorites. And again, it's a way of making it seem more familiar, playing on familiarity cues, and being just different enough. Um, Also, it's probably worth saying, although it's slightly in a different realm, like sometimes those products are just on the menu board as an anchor to prove the value or quality perception of the core range. And that's an absolute core thing when you were thinking about nudge theory and consumer psychology. It's not all products exist to be a success in their own right. They can often be used to change the value and quality perceptions of the products around them. And I think that's something that is really underutilized in marketing. The next the next theory that I want to talk about in terms of de-risking products is the ambiguity effect. And that's to say that, as you know, we just fundamentally dislike uncertainty. It freaks us out. So we'll often avoid options that we consider to be ambiguous or missing information. And if you think about the way that Uber became such a game changer, it's not just about the fact that Uber reduced your waiting time. It was more about the fact that it allowed you to see where your taxi was on a map and let you watch it approach. So, you know, it's in reality, it often isn't about less time waiting, but it's about removing the uncertainty and being less annoyed by the wait because I can see progress. We have a psychological discomfort waiting and the ambiguity of when our taxi will turn up. And the idea that I can stay in the pub and have another drink instead of being nervous on the outside of the road has an intrinsic value to it. You can apply that kind of thinking of the ambiguity effect into retail marketing. I think often, you know, we get into a trap of sort of not being explicitly clear about things like taste profiles or occasion usages or serve structure. And again, it's that ambiguity that it just allows people to freak out enough that it becomes easier to not pick up your product. The next heuristic that we want to talk to you is the herd mentality. Like we all just like to mimic the behavior of the people around us. We always assume that people know the right choices better than how we know ourselves. And we'll often look to others. And you really see that playing out significantly when you look at drink choices in social settings. Like we are so influenced by what we see other people drinking, which is why things like glassware and color of liquid are so important when you're in that category. Um, we work a lot with Aperol, and you'll hear us talk a lot about the orange wave in venues. Like obviously, Aperol benefits from the fact that it is such a distinct color and has a very distinct glassware. But often, at the start of our campaign is really about how do we flood that venue with that orange hue? How do we make sure that the drinks are as visible as they can be to each other? And how do we win that first drink of the night so that it has that build effect from people seeing and copying behavior? So don't underestimate the importance of herd mentality and getting people to mimic behavior of your existing customers. But of course, there's not always a crowd, and when you don't have a crowd to look to, that's where social proof messaging becomes really important. But it does the same thing where it gives us the confidence to act because it allows us to reassure behaviour based on what other people like and what they do. So we'll look around for clues for the right way to behave, particularly in ambiguous circumstances. So we've used the Glenfiddich example here. If you think about whiskey as a category, it's one that's often bought on behalf of others for gifting. So, you know, you get a lot of people kind of at that category looking unsure what to pick up. And actually, their social proof messaging about being the world's most awarded is a really good way of tipping people into behavior and giving them that reassurance. And I think social proofing in terms of the UK's favourites and lots of those kind of very almost down and dirty messages have fallen out of popularity. We tend to find them online more than we do in the retail environment, but actually they are absolutely core and have such a significant change in conversion rates because they really do that reassurance piece and nudge piece.
Cool. So we've looked at some of the biases that impact on how we make choices, but there are also some key psychological effects that steer us when we're in experiencing mode as well. Those times when we might not think we're in a purchase mindset, which for brands can be the most powerful in forming opinions and creating memories. So if the objective is building brand awareness or increasing consideration, there are a few guiding heuristics that can be really helpful in keeping in mind. Just thinking about Apple for a minute, feels like quite an obvious example, but it's obvious for a reason. Like when you think about how people kind of queue up in a line overnight for the latest iPhone, even when their current one works completely fine, it's not because they sat down and did a cost benefit analysis on it. It's because Apple sells a feeling, not just a phone, not just technology. And you see it in their advertising as well. They don't throw a list of specs at you. What they do is they show a heartwarming clip of a dad capturing his child's first steps, or a filmmaker shooting a cinematic masterpiece on an iPhone. They make you feel something. And ultimately, when we feel emotionally moved, we're much more compelled to buy. And that's the fundamental rule of experience. Ultimately, we rely on gut feeling over rational analysis. Logic might come into it later to justify the purchase. You might think, oh, the camera's better, so it's worth it. But ultimately, the decision itself was an emotional one. And that's why brands like Apple and Nike and Coca-Cola, they don't just sell products, they sell stories. They sell identities and emotions, because that's what creates memorable experiences. And that's what we're going to look at here is how to employ some of these techniques to really create kind of memorability and stickiness in the stories that you tell. So our first bias affecting the experiencing side of our brains is the peak end rule. I think we can all relate to the feeling of going on a holiday that was mostly really great, but because your flight home at the end was an absolute nightmare, you might remember the whole trip as negative. Or you might have watched a film that was really slow for 2 hours, but the ending was so incredible that you walked away thinking, God, that was an amazing film. Both of those are examples of the peak end rule in action. And it basically sort of dictates that when we reflect back on experiences we've had, we don't remember every single moment. Instead, we judge it based on two key points: the most intense part, so the peak, whether it was good or bad, and the end of the experience. And that's why companies and events, and even hospitals to an extent, they carefully design the final moments of the experience to really reflect that. So Disney's a great example of this. They make sure that visitors' last ride is really, really magical, so they leave on a high note. And it's also why restaurants often serve a free dessert or a sort of warm thank you at the end of your meal, so you end leaving on a really positive memory. Because ultimately, it's how we remember an experience that matters more than the experience itself. There's a really quite famous example of this, but it's one that demonstrates it so well, so powerfully. It's the Magic Castle Hotel in LA, which doesn't look like a luxury hotel by any means, especially when you compare it to some of the really high-end hotels in and around that area. But the business has a defining peak guest experience. So by its small, very unremarkable swimming pool, there is a landline phone with a simple sign reading Popsicle Hotline. And if you pick up the phone, somebody comes out in a suit with a silver tray in hand and offers you an ice lolly. They present them to you wearing white gloves, like a sort of English butler, all for free. And guests don't remember the average sort of mattress or noisy neighbours. They remember the novelty, which is why it was rated the second best hotel in LA on TripAdvisor. It's a really great example of that in action. And so, yeah, ultimately, it's about just kind of understanding that guests they don't really kind of understand every little detail. They understand those high points and those final memories, and that's all you need to really learn to keep them coming back and advocating for you. Another really great example of it is Warby Parker, the online glasses brand. So prior to the wave of online first glasses brands, buying glasses online seemed really risky. You can't try them on, and you know, even if they don't fit, returning them is a real hassle. But Warby Parker completely flipped that expectation. They knew that people remember the high point and the final impression of an experience, so they designed their home try-on program around that so that it was as memorable and as seamless as possible. They send you 5 frames for free to try on at home with really fun packaging that makes it really easy and seamless to go through that process. And then when you're finished, you send them back in a way that's super easy, prepaid. The return label is already included, and it's just like really hassle free. So instead of feeling like a chore, the final step is really effortless and satisfying, which ultimately leaves customers with a really positive memory of the entire process. And that's peak end rule logic. There is people don't really remember every kind of step of what can be a quite a laborious journey. They remember the excitement of trying on different styles, that peak moment, and they remember the sort of really smooth, hassle-free return process. So another really great example of how brands kind of use the peak end rule to design their customer experiences. So moving on to our second heuristic affecting our experiencing brains. We're all familiar with the ambition of saving money next month, or eating healthier next week, or going to the gym tomorrow. But then when the time comes to it, you just don't for whatever reason. That is what's called hyperbolic discounting in action. So in essence, we value immediate rewards much more than we value future ones, even when the future reward is actually something much more bigger and beneficial for us. Brands use this all the time to shape their experiences. So if you think about Amazon Prime's buy now, get it tomorrow promise, you might not need that new thing straight away, but knowing that it will be in your hands by the morning makes it just irresistible and kind of inspires people to make that purchase. So it can be a really powerful technique for engaging with consumers and tapping into our love for instant rewards, because our brains are wired for that kind of like instant gratification. Which is also why you see brands like Starbucks introducing things like point systems, and you get that little dopamine hit when you have that immediate reward for purchasing something. There's another really good example of this that sort of explains the phenomenon that is Shein. It's become such a huge brand and so widely used. And despite the sort of raising awareness of the damaging environmental effects of fast fashion, so many consumers around the world are still often favouring sort of cheaper alternatives for their clothing choices, and preferring to pay less for sort of a lower quality good. And that's because they've mastered the art of instant gratification. Low prices, constant flash sales, and ultimately the thrill of getting a sort of your next outfit really fast, instead of waiting and saving up for a more expensive or high quality piece. Shoppers will often think, well, I could just spend £6 right now and get that thing immediately, because that immediate reward maybe feels better than waiting for something better later down the line. And they really double down on that instant gratification as well. They gamify the experience. You have daily check-in bonuses and countdown timers and surprise discounts. They're all designed to trigger that buy now instinct before logic kicks in. So it's proof that when brands do make spending feel kind of urgent and fun and low risk, our brains, they struggle to say no. Like we're really we're suckers for that. So that's an example of a brand where maybe it can feel a touch kind of exploitative and to our weaker nature, but some brands do apply this sort of thinking in some slightly more constructive ways. So take Duolingo as an example. The app sort of hacks your brain with hyperbolic discounting. So it uses things to kind of play on our love of instant gratification. You do one short lesson. It's 2 minutes. It barely takes any effort. And what happens with it? You get kind of XP, you get streak points, you get confetti. Your brain it tricks you into thinking that you're making really quick, really fast progress as a result of that. They have things like streak traps where you miss a day and your 100-day streak is going to be over. So you sort of have that fear of missing the sort of short-term benefits that you get from that. There are also things like gems and perks. So every lesson you take earns you gems, and they buy you streak freezes and bonus rounds. So the whole thing is really gamified to really speak to our sort of the side of our brain that is wired towards the sort of immediate rewards. And then just tipping on to the next one, our third and final bias is scarcity. So our brains, they naturally equate rarity or unavailability with much higher value. A limited edition product or a service is definitely perceived as more valuable than one that's widely available. The scarcity principle is reinforced by social proof and commitment as well. When a product is scarce, consumers interpret it as being in high demand and therefore much higher quality. That's why we have seasonal products and limited collaborations and drop culture and exclusive access. They all play into that idea of scarcity having a higher value. And online hotel booking sites, they use this really, really well to kind of to tip us into purchase mode maybe sooner than we might be ready to in their way they design their online experiences. So I'm sure we've all had the experience of browsing for a hotel and you suddenly see only 2 rooms left at this price in bright red. You weren't really sure you were ready to book it, but now you feel like you have to, otherwise you're going to miss out. So when we think that something's running out or in short demand and short supply, we panic and we act faster because losing out feels worse than overpaying for something. And yeah, these booking sites, they really know this, and sometimes they'll increase the messaging around it. Things like 10 other people are looking at this room right now, or the price might go up soon, or only one left. They're all designed to essentially kind of like nudge you towards a purchase sooner rather than later, because they're playing on this idea of scarcity within the process. And Adidas pulled off a real masterclass in scarcity marketing. This is one from a few years back at Coachella. They did an exclusive NFT sneaker airdrop. So at the festival, they essentially airdropped a limited number of exclusive digital sneakers to festival goers in a specific geo-fenced location. If you were there at the exact time, you could claim your digital collectible, but if you missed it, it was kind of like tough luck. You've missed out, and so it really drove hype really effectively for a few reasons. It sort of played on our weakness for sort of fear of missing out, so people sort of rushed to get their hands on it before it was gone forever. This idea of kind of exclusivity having a higher value, so only a select few could get the drop, making it kind of instantly desirable. And then the bragging rights that went with it as well. So owning one wasn't just about the sneaker itself. It was about being part of this kind of elite experience and being part of the moment. So yeah, when you make it sort of time sensitive, locked to a location and ultra limited, it's a really kind of amazing set of ingredients for playing on this idea of scarcity and creating engagement with consumers.
Oh, so I think that's just a real kind of light touch of some of the heuristics that we're often applying to our clients. And I think maybe if we could leave with one takeout, it would be that I think there is a tendency to always want to solve problems logistically, and we tend to put a lot of weight into things that we can measure. If we go back to that sort of data point that we made at the start of the presentation, I think certainly what we find is that often the bigger breakthroughs in terms of value to the consumer comes through solving problems psychologically, and I think more and more that's kind of where the richness lies, and something that we're becoming more and more adept at utilizing. And we just wanted to leave off. We mentioned it earlier. We do have the Consumer Economic Playbook that we'd encourage you to download. We're also offering something called Nudge Lab. So if you want a bespoke set of heuristics that apply specifically to the challenges that you're having with your brand or category or consumer set, then we would love to come in and create a bespoke toolkit and a bespoke playbook for you guys with some strategic application of some of the principles and some others that we didn't get around to talking to about today. But I think that's it from us, unless we did have a Q&A box available, and if there's anything on there, Max, that anyone wanted to ask.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Nick and Chelsea. That was great. We do have a few questions which we can roll through right now. The first one is, can you explain the concept of nudging and how it can be successfully applied in consumer behavior?
Yeah, should I take this one? Um, a lot of the principles that we talked about, particularly in the conversion, would be considered nudge principles, but it's a way of framing information and choice and relies a lot on choice architecture, and it's ways of subtly tipping into behavior. And I think a lot of that de-risking stuff that we spoke about at the beginning applies, but nudge as a principle kind of has a huge amount of research behind it, and it's really been used to frame choice in the most convincing and impactful ways. And I think if it's a subject you're interested in, there's so many case studies online around how just framing a message to imply social norming or social proofing or loss aversion has this kind of absolutely significant shift in terms of getting people to do the desired behavior.
Brilliant, nice. We have another question here, which is, can you offer an example of consumer nudging which had a positive sustainability impact?
Yeah, I think actually that quite a lot of quite often I think the environmental conversation and the way that it's been positioned actually probably often is flying in the face of behavioral economic principles. And I think there's probably a bit of a uh, there's probably been a bit of a reliance on doomsdaying and getting people to sort of almost scaremongering. And I think actually what would be much more powerful is some of those more social proofing messages about I think there's a tendency for people to think that their behavior doesn't have much impact, whereas actually what social proofing does is allows you to be a bit more hopeful in terms of what other people are doing and what's expected of me. And if you norm behavior, often people follow suit. The one that comes to mind is I can't think of a retail example specifically, but in the hotel industry, you'll often get messaging in the bathroom around, you know, two-thirds of or 80% of consumers aren't changing their towels daily. Can you join them and help us reduce the impact? And I think actually there is a whole body of research on how impactful that as a message has been in terms of getting people to see that as the norm and then want to be part of the norm. And I think there is so much that we could apply in for brands and in the retail and experience space that could really borrow from that thinking.
Cool.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think certain brands are using the going back to that point around how we're very kind of short-termist in our behaviors. You know, we seek kind of instant gratification, and we struggle to prioritize things that seem far off in the distance. And I think that's often the challenge with things like climate change, is that they do feel sort of very distant and hard to figure out what the best thing to do today to like make a difference is. And there are brands like Oddbox, where they're essentially breaking the challenge down into like much smaller, manageable, kind of instantaneous ways of dealing with it. So you spend your money, you get your kind of like discarded fruit and veg on a weekly basis, and then that compounds over the long term and has like a massive impact over the course of a year, for example. So I think, yeah, brands that sort of employ that technique of breaking it down into kind of more immediate, short-term actions that you can take that ultimately ladder up to like a bigger long-term goal is a really great way of kind of dealing with that kind of thing.
Nice. Yeah. We have one final question. How do social and cultural factors influence the way consumers make choices?
I think the thing that is really powerful about behavioral economics is there isn't a cultural nuance to it because it is so, or there's, sorry, I should reframe that. There's very little cultural nuance to it because it's biological and it's about how our brains react, and it goes back into how we survived, and that it doesn't shift and change. It has actually very little nuance depending on culture. So I think as a baseline, if you're looking at global campaigns or trying to change behavior on a global perspective, actually behavioral economics is a real I want to say easy shortcut into thinking about mass thinking on that mass scale. I think once you get into sort of more the system two side of the brain, so you can deal with system one with behavior economics. Obviously, when you get to system two, there is there is definitely the cultural nuance and the sort of more rational things that people react to has such a big cultural influence. But I'd say that's one of the sort of the bigger benefits to behavior economics is the kind of the kind of mass generalization that it applies to.
Amazing. Nick, Chelsea, thank you very much. I think we can put a cap on it there. Everyone who's joining us today, thank you for your time. Hopefully, you'll be able to find the behavioral economics playbook on our quantum website and also get in touch if you're interested in our Nudge Labs offering. But for now, hopefully, everyone has a lovely day and we'll hear from you soon. Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
guys.
Thanks very much.
Bye.
Cheers.
Bye.